The last dose was measured out in the blue drawing room on the morning of the November frost, and Eleanor Hartwell watched a gloved hand tip it into the Duke's chocolate without once suspecting that she had just become the only living person who knew. She was standing at the sideboard, with a folded shawl over her arm, close enough to see the little vial catch the gray light, far enough that no one thought to look at her at all. That was the whole condition of her life at Whitmere Hall. She was a companion to the Duke of Aldenmere, a woman of 24, with good manners and no fortune. And to the household, she was furniture that could pour tea. The powder went into the cup went to the old man by the fire, and Eleanor, who had learned long ago that a servant who sees too much is a servant, soon dismissed, said nothing, and let her heart do the only thing it could, which was to hammer against her ribs while her face stayed as smooth as the frost on the glass. If you have ever known a thing you could not prove, and carried it alone through rooms full of people who would not believe you, then you already understand the weight she carried up the back stairs that morning. Stay with her. She is going to need someone to. The man who brought the powder was Mr. Crane, the Baron's cousin, and he had been at Whitmere Hall for 3 months on the strength of a family connection nobody quite remembered agreeing to. He was a pleasant man, or wore the shape of one. He read to the Duke in the afternoons. He walked the old man to the window and back. He knew the names of all the servants and used them, which the family never did, and this had made the household fond of him in a way Eleanor had found strange from the first, because fondness is a currency, and she had wondered even then why a distant cousin should be spending so much of it. Now she knew. Fondness bought him the freedom to move through the house unwatched, and an unwatched man beside a dying duke is the most dangerous thing in England. The Duke of Aldenmere had not always been dying. When Eleanor arrived at Whitmere Hall in the spring, engaged by letter to sit with an ailing old man and read him his correspondence, she had found him sharp as a blade and twice as impatient. He had lost a wife decades gone, and a daughter more recently, and he had one grandson left in the world, and he spoke of that grandson the way men speak of weather they cannot control. The grandson was abroad. The grandson did not write. The grandson, the Duke said, had left the country the day after the funeral, had not been seen since, and if Eleanor thought that was any of her concern, she was welcome to think it on her own time. She had liked him at once. A man that rude was a man who had been disappointed by someone he loved, and she knew a great deal about that. By summer, the Duke had begun to fail. It came slowly. The way the title of Mr. Pomms, Crane's ambition would have wanted it to come. A loss of appetite here, a trembling in the hands there, a confusion that arrived only in the late afternoons and only after his chocolate. The physician came and frowned and spoke of age and of the heart. Nobody in the household connected the decline to the cup, because nobody in the household was watching the cup. Eleanor was. She had watched it for 6 weeks before the November morning, and she had told herself 100 stories to explain what she saw, because the truth was so monstrous that a sane woman reached for anything gentler. Mr. Crane was careless with the medicines. Mr. Crane had mistaken one powder for another. Mr. Crane was a fool. She had exhausted every kind explanation, and on the morning of the frost, standing at the sideboard with the shawl over her arm, she ran out of them. To the family she was nothing. To Mr. Crane, she was less than nothing. And this was the danger, and also, though she did not yet know it, the beginning of her one advantage. The household above stairs consisted of the Duke's late daughter's sister-in-law, a widow named Lady Margaret Vale, who had installed herself at Whitmere Hall to manage what she called the difficult time, and who managed it chiefly by managing everyone in it. Lady Margaret was not a cruel woman by her own reckoning. She was a frightened one, though she would have died before naming the fear. And her fear had a shape. The shape was money. Whitmere Hall was entailed, and the entail ran to the grandson, and the grandson was abroad and silent, and Lady Margaret had spent 3 years arranging her life around the comfortable expectation that a silent heir was as good as an absent one. Into that expectation Mr. Crane had walked with his pleasant face and his family connection and his suggestions, always suggestions, never demands, that perhaps the grandson would not return, that perhaps arrangements should be made, that perhaps a marriage between the right cousins could keep the estate safe from a young man who had shown it nothing but his back. Eleanor understood the arithmetic before she understood the poison. She had understood it at dinner in her second week, when Lady Margaret had introduced her to a visiting family and had called her, with a small, cool smile, the companion we took in out of charity, a girl with no people to speak of. That was the first time the label was fixed to her, and it was fixed in company, over the soup with the candlelight catching Lady Margaret's earrings, and Eleanor had felt the whole table decide in a single breath that she was exactly what she had been called and nothing more. A girl with no people. She had smiled and passed the salt. She had learned young that the only reply to that kind of remark was silence, and that silence kept long enough could pass for dignity. She took her knowledge up the back stairs that November morning, and she sat on the edge of her narrow bed in the narrow room under the eaves, and she made herself think. If she went to the physician would ask what a companion knew of medicine, and would write to Lady Margaret to complain of an hysterical girl. If she went to Lady Margaret would hear an accusation against the man she was half planning to marry into the family, and would dismiss the accuser by nightfall. If she went to a magistrate, she would be a servant, making a charge of murder against a gentleman, with no evidence but her own eyes, and she would be laughed out of the county, and ruined in it besides. There was no door in the house of her situation that opened outward. She was locked in with a killing, and the only person who knew the door existed was the man holding the key. What she did instead was small, and it was the bravest thing she had ever done. She began to keep the cup. Every morning, after that, when Mr. Crane prepared the Duke's chocolate and set it to cool and turned away, Eleanor found a reason to be near it. A dropped shawl, a question about the fire, a message she had suddenly remembered. And in the turning of his back, she exchanged the cup for a clean one. She had prepared herself, and the poisoned cup she carried up the back stairs and poured into a small, stoppered bottle she kept behind a loose board under the eaves. She did not know what she would do with it. She only knew that a thing which could not be proved on the morning of the frost might one day be proved by a bottle, and that if she did nothing at all, the Duke would be dead by Christmas, and Mr. Crane would read a very moving eulogy. So, she kept the cup. The Duke, drinking clean chocolate for the first time in 6 weeks, began within days to sleep better and to wake sharper, and the confusion that came in the late afternoons began to lift, and the physician came and frowned, and spoke now of a rally, of the resilience of old blood, of the mysterious mercies of the body. Mr. Crane's pleasant face, watching the old man improve, developed a small line between the brows that had not been there before. The Duke noticed her before he understood her. He noticed that his companion had grown quiet and watchful, that she flinched at the chocolate cup and relaxed only when he had drained it, that she had taken to sitting where she could see the door. He was a sharp old man even in his decline, and a sharp old man who has been dying and to stop dying starts to ask why he did not ask her. He watched her the way she was watching the cup, and one gray afternoon by the fire he said, without turning his head, that she had the look of a woman guarding something, and that in his experience such women were either thieves or the only honest person in the house, and he had not yet decided which she was. Eleanor's hands went still on the mending in her lap. She told him she did not take his meaning. He said that was a pity, because he had begun to think that she might be the only person at Whitmere Hall he could afford to trust, and a man in his position could not afford to be wrong about that. She did not tell him. Not that afternoon. She was too afraid, and the fear was rational, and I want you to sit with how rational it was. Because the stories we love best are the ones where courage is not the absence of good reasons to run. If you are still with her, and I hope you are, hold on. The house is about to get colder before the fire is lit. The grandson came home on the second week of December, without warning, in a traveling coat still wet with the road. His name was Julian Aldenmuir, and he was the Duke's heir, and he had been in Lisbon and then in worse places for 3 years, and he arrived at Whitmere Hall in the early dark, with snow melting in his dark hair and a stillness about him that emptied the front hall of noise the moment he stepped into it. Eleanor was on the stairs with a candle when he came in, She stopped where she stood. He was younger than she had pictured, this silent, ungrateful air, and harder. And there was a grief worn so deep into his face that it had stopped looking like grief and had started looking like weather. He looked up and saw her on the stairs with a candle, a plain woman in a gray gown holding a small flame. And something in his face changed for less than a second, and then closed again. And he asked her, in a low, even voice, where his grandfather was. She should have told him every reasonable calculation said the heir was the one person with the power and the motive to act on what she knew. She had spent 3 years learning, though, that the family closes ranks, that a servant's word is nothing against a gentleman's, and she did not yet know whether this cold young man was a door out or another wall. So she told him only that the Duke was in the blue drawing-room and had improved of late, and she watched his face when she said improved, and she saw him note the word the way a soldier notes a sound in the dark. He thanked her, which the family never did, and he went in to his grandfather, and Eleanor stood on the stairs a long moment with the candle guttering and understood that the house had just acquired a second person who was watching. What Julian found in the blue drawing-room reordered him, though he showed almost nothing. He had left 3 years ago a young man half wild, with a grief. He could not sit inside, the grief of a mother dead and a father dead before her, and a family that had met his mourning with propriety and a reading of the will. He had gone abroad to outrun it, and had learned, in the outrunning, a great deal about the ways men die and the ways they are helped to. He came home expecting to bury an old man and inherit a cold house. He found the old man mending, and a companion who flinched at a cup, and a pleasant cousin he had never heard of installed at his grandfather's elbow, and within an hour of his arrival, Julian Aldenmuir had begun, very quietly, to count. Lady Margaret was not pleased to see him, and hid it beautifully. She had arranged a supper his first night, a small warm gathering, she called it, with Mr. Blue, Crane at the Duke's right hand, and a young woman named Miss Sophia Pennington, placed with great care at Julian's. Miss Pennington was the daughter of a good family, and the possessor of £11,000, and a face that had never once been told it was anything but lovely, and Lady Margaret had been assembling the case for a match between her and the estate for the better part of a year. She had simply been uncertain, until December, which body the estate would be attached to. The grandson's return solved the uncertainty and threatened everything else, and Lady Margaret adjusted, with the speed of a woman who has never in her life allowed a fact to inconvenience a plan. Over the supper she praised Miss Pennington's playing and Miss Pennington's needlework and Miss Pennington's understanding of what a great house required, and she mentioned in passing warmly that the companion Eleanor had been such a help during the difficult time, poor girl, a companion with no people. One did what one could for such women. There it was again. The second voicing, in company, over the supper with the candlelight and the good silver, the label fixed a second time in front of witnesses so that everyone at the table might refresh their certainty. A companion with no people. Eleanor, who was not at the table but standing near the door in case she was wanted, felt the words land and kept her face still. This time, though, she was not the only one who heard them. Julian Aldenmuir, who had said almost nothing all evening, turned his head very slightly toward the door where the plain woman in gray was standing, and he looked at her for exactly as long as it took Lady Margaret to finish her sentence, and then he looked away, and no one at the table marked it but Eleanor, whose skin knew where his eyes had been before. Her mind gave her leave to notice. She lay awake that night, with her heart doing the foolish thing hearts do, and she was furious with it. She could not afford to be seen by anyone. To be seen was to be dismissed. She had built her whole survival on being furniture, and now a man with a hard face and a soldier's stillness had looked at her across a room as though she were a person, and her body had answered before her sense could stop it, and she lay in the narrow bed under the eaves and told herself very sternly that a look was not a door, that grief was not tenderness, that the heir to a dukedom did not see companions with no people, and that she had a killing to prove, and no time at all for the particular warmth that had bloomed under her ribs when he turned his head. Julian found her the next morning in the library, alone, at the hour before the house woke. which was the only hour Eleanor had ever been able to call her own. She had gone there to think. He had gone there, she understood at once, to find her because he shut the door behind him, and the shutting of a door between an unmarried woman and a gentleman was a transgression she felt in her spine, and he stood with his back to it and said, without preamble, that his grandfather had been dying since the summer, and had stopped, and that a man did not stop dying without a reason, and that she flinched at the chocolate cup, and he wished to know why. Eleanor stood among the tall shelves with the gray dawn at the windows, and understood that the moment she had been walking toward for 6 weeks had arrived without her consent. She could deny it. She could keep her furniture's silence, and let the air make of it what he would. Or she could tell the truth to the one person in England who might have the power and the will to act on it, and risk everything she had, which was almost nothing, which was the small stoppered bottle behind the loose board, and her own good name and her place in the only house that had taken her in. She told him. She told him plainly and in order, the powder in the vial, and the 6 weeks, and the cup she had been keeping, and she did not weep or plead or soften it, because she had rehearsed this telling 100 times in the narrow bed, and had resolved that if she ever said it aloud, she would say it like a woman giving evidence, and not like a girl begging to be. Believed. Julian listened without moving. When she finished, he was silent for a long moment, and in that silence she felt the old certainty rise, that he would call her hysterical or scheming, that the family would close, that she had just handed a gentleman the rope to hang her with. Then he asked her one question. He asked whether she still had the bottle. And when she said yes, something moved in his hard face that she had no name for, and he said, his voice very low, that she had kept his grandfather alive, for 6 weeks alone in a house full of people who would not have believed her, and that he did not know yet what kind of woman did such a thing, but he intended to find out. It was not a compliment. It was heavier than a compliment. Eleanor felt it settle on her like a hand between the shoulder blades, and she looked away first. They became, over the gray weeks of December, conspirators, which is a particular kind of intimacy the marriage market has no name for. Julian could not act openly. To accuse Mr. Bundope, Crane without proof, was to invite the man to finish the work quickly and vanish. And to accuse him in front of Lady Margaret was to warn the one person whose plans required the Duke's death and the heir's absence. So they moved in the dark. Eleanor kept exchanging the cups. Julian, who had learned patience in places he did not name, began quietly to write letters. To a physician in London who studied poisons, to a man he had known in the army who now did discreet work for the courts, to the family solicitor whose loyalty he tested with small, careful questions before he trusted him with large ones. And in the moving in the dark they were thrown together at odd hours, in the library before dawn, on the cold terrace where a conversation could not be overheard, in the corridor outside the Duke's room, where they passed the exchanged cup between them like a sacrament. And Eleanor learned the particular danger of doing brave and secret work beside a man whose stillness had begun to feel like safety. He gave her commands. It was his way. She came to see the way a man speaks who has learned that softness gets people killed. "Eat something," he said, when he found her gray with a night's lost sleep. "Sit down," he said, when she swayed on her feet in the cold corridor. "Do not carry that yourself," he said, and took the tray from her hands, and their fingers touched at the edge of it for the length of a held breath, and neither of them moved, and the chocolate steamed between them in the cold air. And, somewhere below, a clock struck the hour and broke the moment, and she took the tray back, and did not look at him. She read his commands as coldness, because coldness was safer to believe. The audience of her own heart read them as something else. "Come in from the cold," he said to her on the terrace one night, when the snow had begun, and she stood at the balustrade too long. It was an order. It was also the only way he had ever been taught to say a gentler thing. And she heard, underneath the order, the shape of the gentler thing, and she came in from the cold. And she was careful not to let him see that she had heard it. The wound in him surfaced on the coldest night of the year, and it surfaced because she asked him a question she had no right to ask, They were in the library waiting for a letter that had not come, and she asked him why he had left. Not as a servant, as a woman who had begun to understand him and wanted the last piece. He was quiet so long, she thought she had lost the fragile thing between them. Then he told her in the flat, even voice he used for the things that cost him most, that when his mother was dying, he had been 3 days' ride away at a friend's shooting party, and that a letter had come to call him home, and that he had not opened it for 2 days because he had been young and happy and had not wanted the happiness to end, and that when he finally broke the seal, she had been dead a day. Why? He had come home to a house arranging her funeral and reading her will, and he had stood in the blue drawing room while his family discussed the disposition of her jewelry over her coffin, and he had understood that he lived among people who could bury a woman and settle her estate in the same breath. And he had left the next morning, and had not been able to make himself come back, until he thought the old man was dying too. He had spent 3 years believing he had killed his mother by not opening a letter. He had come home to bury the last of his family, and instead he had found a companion with no people keeping his grandfather alive, one stolen cup at a time, in a house of people who would bury a duke and settle his estate in the same breath, and he did not, he said, intend to arrive too late a second time. Eleanor did not reach for him. She wanted to, and the wanting was a live thing in her hands, and she kept her hands in her lap, because she was a companion with no people, and he was the heir to a dukedom, and the distance between them was written into the laws of the country they stood in. She told him the truth instead, which was the only gift she had. She told him that a letter unopened for 2 days was the act of a young man who loved his life, not of a man who wished his mother dead, and that grief looks for a crime because grief cannot bear an accident, and that she knew this because she had lost her own people to an accident and had spent years hunting for the crime that would have made it bearable, and had never found one because there had not been one, because sometimes the world simply takes, and there is no one to blame, and that is the hardest thing of all to forgive. He looked at her then, the way a man looks at a light he did not expect to find in a dark room. He did not touch her. He took 1 step toward her, though, and stopped, and the not touching was louder than any touch could have been, and they stood a foot apart in the cold library with the wanting between them like a third presence in the room, and then a floorboard creaked in the corridor, and they were conspirators again. The letters began to come. The London physician wrote that the symptoms Julian described without naming the house or the man, were consistent with a slow poison known to the trade, and that the powder Eleanor had kept, when a portion was sent discreetly to be examined, was very likely that poison, and nothing else. The solicitor wrote, having tested Small and found firm, that the estate's affairs had been quietly reordered in the past year, that Lady Margaret had been granted powers over the household accounts that a widow of her position had no ordinary claim to, and that certain of those powers had been drafted by a man whose hand the solicitor recognized, because he had seen it before on documents connected to 2 other elderly gentlemen who had died richer than they lived and left their fortunes to unexpected cousins. Mr. Crane, it emerged, had done this before. He was not the Baron's cousin at all, or was only distantly, and the Baron himself had died 4 years past of a wasting illness that no one had thought to question, and Mr. Crane had walked away from that deathbed with a legacy and a method, and had gone looking for the next lonely old man with a large house and a distracted family. He was a professional. He had chosen Whitmere Hall the way a farmer chooses a field, and he had noticed, by the middle of December, that the field had stopped yielding. The Duke was mending. The heir was home and watchful. The pleasant cousin's small, careful plan, 3 months in the building, was coming apart in a way he could not account for, and a man who is killed for a living does not sit quietly while his work unravels. Mr. Deda. Crane began to watch the household as closely as Eleanor and Julian were watching him, and what he saw at last was a companion with no people who was always near the chocolate cup. He was not a fool. He had underestimated her precisely because everyone underestimated her, and when he corrected the error, he corrected it fast. On the morning of the 23rd of December, Eleanor came down to prepare the Duke's cup, and found Mr. Cass Crane already in the small pantry waiting for her, pleasant as ever, and he told her, in a low, friendly voice, that he had begun to think she was not quite the simple creature the house believed her to be, and that clever girls with no people had a way of coming to unfortunate ends, and that she would do well to remember how very alone in the world she was, and how little anyone would trouble to ask questions if a charity companion were to fall ill, or leave suddenly, or be found to have stolen from the family that had taken her in. It was the third voicing of the label, and it was the cruelest, because this time the words, "a girl with no people," were not a dismissal but a threat, spoken low in a cold pantry by a man who had killed before, and Eleanor understood that he had just told her in the polite language of gentlemen that he intended to be rid of her. She did not run. She went white, and her hands shook, and she was more frightened than she had ever been in her life. She did not run, though, because she had spent 6 weeks keeping cups behind a loose board, and she was not going to hand this man the last of the field. Now, she looked at him and she said in a voice that shook and did not stop, that he should be careful of clever girls with no people, because a girl with nothing to lose is the only kind of person in the world who cannot be bought or frightened, and that he did not know what she had, or where, or who else had seen it. It was a bluff, and it was not a bluff. She had the bottle. She did not yet have proof that would stand in a court against a gentleman. She saw the small line deepen between his brows, though, and she understood that she had frightened him, a little for the first time, and that the frightening had made her more dangerous to him, not less, and that she had perhaps just bought herself an enemy who would move quickly now. She was right. Mr. Crane moved that night. He went to Lady Margaret, and he told her, in the tone of a man reluctant to bring bad news, that the companion had been behaving strangely, that small things had gone missing from the house, that he feared the girl was not honest, and that for the sake of the family in this difficult time, who seemed to have taken some odd interest in her, could be embarrassed by the connection. Lady Margaret, who had a supper planned for Christmas Eve, a real supper, the county invited, the match between Miss Pennington and the estate, to be all but announced, heard exactly what she wished to hear. A tidy solution to an inconvenient girl. She sent for Eleanor at once, and in front of Mr. Bister, Crane in the blue drawing-room where the last dose had been measured out on the morning of the frost, she told the companion with no people that her services would no longer be required, that she was to be gone by morning, and that she might consider herself fortunate the family did not choose to pursue the question of the missing items further. It was the dark moment, and it was total. Eleanor stood in the room where the whole thing had begun, dismissed and disgraced, and about to be turned out into a Christmas frost, with no character and no people, and the one piece of evidence that could save the Duke's life hidden behind a board in a room she was being ordered to leave. She did not defend herself. She could not. Not there, not to Lady Margaret, not with Mr. Crane standing pleasant and patient by the fire waiting for the door to close on the last person who knew what he was. She curtsied. She said she was sorry to have given offense, and she went up the back stairs one final time to pack a small bag and to take the bottle from behind the board, and she sat on the edge of the narrow bed under the eaves and let herself, for the length of one candle, be as frightened and as alone as she truly was. Then she wrapped the bottle in a stocking and put it in the bag, and she did the last brave thing, which was to decide that she would not disappear quietly, that she would go to Julian before she left, that she would put the bottle in the hands of the one person who could use it, whatever it cost her, because a duke's life was worth more than a companion's good name, and she had known that from the morning of the frost. She did not have to find him. He found her on the back stairs at midnight, and he had a letter in his hand. The last letter, the one from the man who did discreet work for the courts, and his face when he looked at her was not still at all. He had heard. The whole house had heard by now that the companion was dismissed for theft, and he had known at once whose hand was in it, and he had come up the servants' stair 2 at a time to find her. And when he saw her on the landing with the small bag in her hand and the fright on her face, he stopped 1 step below her so that for once they stood eye to eye. And he said her name. Not Miss Hartwell. Eleanor. He said it the way a man says a word he has been holding in his mouth for weeks, and it undid something in her that dismissal and threats had not been able to touch. He told her she was not leaving. He told her the letter in his hand named Mr. Crane by his true history, 2 dead men and their stolen fortunes, and that, combined with her bottle and the physician's word, it was enough at last, more than enough, and that he had been a coward once about a letter and had spent 3 years paying for it and did not intend to let her walk into the frost alone while he had the power to stop it. And then he did the thing he had not let himself do in the cold library, the thing he had stepped toward and away from 12 times. He lifted his hand slowly, giving her every moment to refuse it, and he laid it against the side of her face. And she turned her cheek into his palm and closed her eyes, and neither of them said anything at all, because everything that needed saying had already been said in 6 weeks of stolen cups and cold terraces and a name spoken on a stair. The Christmas Eve supper went forward because Julian led it. He wanted the county in the house. He wanted witnesses. The same witnesses who had heard Eleanor called a girl with no people over the soup, the same drawing room where she had been dismissed, the same arena in every particular, because a verdict rendered in public can only be overturned in public, and he had learned patience in hard places and knew the value of choosing the ground. Lady Margaret, believing the companion gone and the field clear, was radiant. Mr. Crane, believing the same, was pleasant. Miss Pennington played, and played well, and was placed at Julian's side, and the county murmured its approval of so suitable a match, and the Duke, mending sharp, sat by the fire and watched his grandson with the eyes of a man who has understood more than anyone has told him. Julian rose to speak when the room was fullest. He thanked the county for coming. He said the family had passed through a difficult season and had reason this Christmas to be grateful, and here he paused, and the room leaned in for the announcement. It had been promised, the match, the estate made safe. And then Julian Aldenmuir crossed the room. He crossed it in the ceremonial silence of 100 watching faces, past Miss Pennington, past Lady Margaret with her hand frozen halfway to her fan, to the doorway where Eleanor Hartwell stood in the same gray gown, brought down by his own instruction. And he took her hand in front of the whole county, and he said the only words the moment needed. "This is the woman who saved his life." 6 words, and the room went so still that the fire was the loudest thing in it. Then, before anyone could breathe, Julian turned to the fireplace, where Mr. Dean Crane stood pleasant no longer, and he laid the letter and the physician's report on the mantel between them, and he named the 2 dead men, and he said that a magistrate was already on the road from the county town, sent for that afternoon, and that the doors of Whitmere Hall would stay shut until he arrived. Mr. Crane's pleasant face came apart in stages the way the Duke had come apart over 6 weeks, and he reached the door and found Julian's steward in front of it, and he understood at last that the field had not merely stopped yielding, but had closed over him entirely. Lady Margaret's hand never reached her fan. She sat very still as the shape of what she had nearly done, and what she had nearly married into the family, assembled itself in front of the whole county, and she was not destroyed, because the niche of the world she lived in does not destroy such women, but she was corrected, publicly and finally, and she recognized her error in the same room where she had made it, and some part of her, the frightened part, that had only ever wanted to be safe, was almost relieved to be stopped. The magistrate came before midnight and took Mr. Crane away, and the 2 dead men whose fortunes he had stolen would be spoken for at last by a companion with no people who had kept a cup. The county went home in the snow with a great deal to say. And the Duke of Aldenmuir, who had said almost nothing all evening, called Eleanor to his chair by the fire when the room had emptied, and told her that he had said, weeks ago, that she was either a thief or the only honest person in the house, and that he had made his decision, and that a man who owed a woman his life did not intend to see her turned out into any frost while he drew breath. He was as rude about it as he had ever been about anything, and Eleanor understood that the rudeness was the whole of his tenderness, the way his grandson's commands had been, and she thanked him, and did not weep until she had left the room. The frost held through Christmas and into the New Year, and by the first thaw, the shape of the household had changed past recognizing. Mr. Crane was gone to answer for what he was. Lady Margaret had removed to a smaller establishment of her own, quieter and wiser and never quite so certain again. Miss Pennington had married a baronet in the spring and been perfectly content. And Eleanor Hartwell, who had come to Whitmere Hall to sit with a dying old man and read him his letters, sat instead in the blue drawing-room on a bright cold morning with the light coming clean through the tall windows, and the small stoppered bottle stood empty now on the mantel, washed and kept, not as evidence any longer, but as the one thing in the house that told the truth about how near the whole family had come to the dark, and about the plain woman who had stood between them and it alone. Julian came in from the cold, with snow melting in his dark hair the way he had the first night, only there was no grief worn into his face now like weather, or, if there was, it had made its peace with the rest of him. He crossed the room to her chair, and he did not give her a command. He said her name, only her name, the way he had said it on the stair, and he held out his hand, and this time there was no letter in it, and no county watching, and nothing at all between them but the choosing. She put her hand in his. Behind them the fire settled in the grate, and beyond the tall windows the snow came down on the grounds of the house that would be theirs, and on the mantel the little bottle caught the light the way the vial had caught it on the morning of the frost. Only now it held nothing and could harm no one, and had done its whole terrible work of keeping the truth until the truth had somewhere safe to land. She had been a girl with no people. She had a person, now, and a house, and a fire, and a name spoken in a low voice, like the gentlest thing a hard man had ever learned to say. And the old Duke, dozing by the fire with his color come back, and his hands gone still and his grandson's hand in the hand of the companion who had saved him, woke just long enough to see the two of them there in the clean morning light, and closed his eyes again, and was for the first time in a very long while, entirely content. If Eleanor's long silence and the courage it finally broke into stayed with you, stay a moment longer in the quiet of it before you go. Some stories are about being rescued. This one was about the woman who kept the cup, until someone finally believed her.